Hello! Happy Godzilla Day and welcome to the first part of what will be my video on Shin Godzilla. As with my King of the Monsters Great Joy video, I will be releasing sections of the whole work before releasing the full video later this year, hopefully. This will not only give everyone something to watch in the meantime, but allow people to give their thoughts on the subject, and, possibly, have input into the eventual final work. With all that said, let's get on with the video. Rough diamonds are priceless. They are the untouched gems of the earth, whose potential is only limited by the imagination and skill of those willing to shape them. Just so are the ideas of a creative mind. Fresh and raw, these ideas are full of potential, but just like a diamond, they need to be shaped to take their final form. Shin Godzilla is a diamond whose substance was forged over many years and whose form was carved from more recent events. A simple glance is eye-catching. A sustained look is fascinating. But look too closely and tiny fractures will become clear. Even closer and for too long, and that gleam, that shimmer of light you saw initially, suddenly materializes as a crack running through the precious gem. This is the best way I can describe the film Shin Godzilla in a short amount of time. Its history, its creation, its manifestation, all are the hard work of talented hands. The final product is a work of art, holding much value as well as future potential. But as close to a masterpiece as Shin Godzilla is, there is also a flaw in it that will forever keep it from reaching such heights. It is undeniably a treasure to behold, just not a perfect one. With that said, let us examine why exactly Shin Godzilla is a fractured diamond. Shin Godzilla opens with the Toho Company logo, twice. Once for the contemporary version and again for the older logo seen at the start of so many classic Godzilla films. These are accompanied by the booming footsteps of a long ago classic, and followed by the name of the film in bold black and white and the bellow of a cinematic legend. All of this is a near facsimile of the 1954 Gojira. Before even the first scene of the film has started, Shin Godzilla is laying its cards on the table. It's telling us this is going to be the old film but new, a classic reimagined. From these logos and titles alone we can expect something more serious, more thematic, more politically charged. This ain't your mama's Godzilla, this is your grandmama's Godzilla. Reminiscent of such mysterious vessels as the Mary Celeste. But there is little time to explore this mystery before the craft is rocked and filled with steam. Here I'm going to split Shin Godzilla into two. We will come back to the start of the film to examine the actions of the human car, Godzilla. Godzilla makes himself known with an earthquake and by boiling the water in Tokyo Bay. This is closely followed by torrent waves. The waters begin to settle as the steam dies down, but this is only the calm before the storm, the first real sign that something is alive down there. Shortly after, Godzilla begins his journey, swimming to shore and ploughing his way upriver, smashing boats and nearby buildings and cars in his wake. It is here we get our first terrifying glance at the glaring eye of the monster. This is a great start to the film and a great build-up to the introduction of the new Godzilla. There's mystery, tension, speculation, mixed in with a disgust at the red fluid, and as this Proto-Godzilla, more on that in a second, crawls up the river, like the original Godzilla symbolized the destruction unregulated nuclear weapons could cause, so too this Proto-Godzilla is a metaphor for the destructive force of the earthquake and tsunami experienced in 2011. Legendary's 2014 Godzilla would embody a similar natural disaster, but unlike that film, Shin Godzilla would be far more on the nose about its meaning. For me, the giant glaring eye appearing for but a moment amongst the debris is meant to hint at the unforeseen, unnatural horrors the initial natural disaster would unleash. Before long, Godzilla is on the Sorry. He takes the path of least resistance, stomping his way through the streets of the city. Now, I understand why this version of Godzilla looks like he does. I understand, but it doesn't make it any less funny. Seriously, this is the first look at a Japanese Godzilla in 12 years, and this is the shot they went with? More to the point, this is the design? The look is supposedly based on the frilled shark, a fish native to the waters of Japan that retains many traits found in extinct species from 150 million years ago. Much like the coelacanth, the frilled shark is essentially a living fossil, which works quite nicely as an update to the Godzilla is a dinosaur origin, which is why our first look at the new Godzilla is what it is. It's a frilled shark mutated by nuclear waste into a new, horrifying creature. It's also leaking blood, which confirms that the disgusting dark red fluid leaking into the tunnels and spreading into the water earlier was the creature bleeding. Everything about the design of this Proto-Godzilla is meant to convey a sense of not rightness, from its look to the way it moves to what it leaves behind. This creature is suffering from mismanaged nuclear waste, a theme consistent throughout Godzilla's history, and one that links directly to the events Shin Godzilla is criticizing. That glaring eye peeking through the wreckage of the boats earlier is representative of the unpredicted nuclear meltdown that the 2011 tsunami would eventually cause. All of which can be easily missed because you're too busy laughing at its gormless mug. I'm not being overly satirical here. There's even a plush of it, for crying out loud. No, I don't have one. Not for lack of trying. Anyway, for a while it appears that the people of the city will be safe, so whatever force is directing him, whatever source is drawing him onwards, Godzilla abandons the streets and tries to climb over. Godzilla suddenly collapses on his belly, his massive body wearing him out on land, his gills struggling to breathe the air. Or whatever process caused his skin to tear and gills to bleed has finally done him in. But just as it seems he's done and dusted, Godzilla changes, and the formerly silent monster. The ambiguity of Godzilla's goals in this film are never questioned. I do like that he follows the roads though, at least for the most part. Some animals have been found following man-made features when navigating the land. Seeing this Godzilla do the same is a nice little touch in that regard. Extra slice of insecurity to the scene and removes the sense of safety found within. This is consistent with the inspiration for and theme of Shin Godzilla. The natural disasters of the earthquake and tsunami, though terrible, were somewhat negated by the more modern structures that people sought shelter in. Then the nuclear power plant melted down and suddenly these bastions of safety were not safe anymore. Godzilla suddenly climbing and crushing a building, seemingly at random, exposes human fragility in the face of disaster. I do have some issues with the sense of scale though. Despite this being the smallest version of Godzilla we see in the film, it is still bloody big. Yet when scaling this building, flopping over it almost comically, he moves far too fast. Then there's the crawling shot, he's holding his body off the floor. That makes the giants for the transformation I'm glad they didn't show it again. For whatever reason, they went with this rippling effect on his skin, and honestly, I thought there was something wrong with my screen when I saw it. It doesn't look like an organic process taking place, it looks like a visual copy. It gets this bulbous, almost ridiculous looking creature into a more familiar shape. And it also represents the changing nature of not only all natural disasters, but specifically the 2011 one as already mentioned. This Godzilla roars with the deep bellow of the original Godzilla from 1954. I can see why they chose this roar for this form. It's a similar size to the 54 Godzilla and is the stage before the next larger form, just like how Godzilla's size increased film after film. However, I don't think this is a good fit for this form, but I'll get more into that in a bit. Godzilla stands upright and begins to waddle forward, adjusting to his new form. But it's not long before military helicopters arrive. There is a standoff, the helicopters hovering before Godzilla as they stare each other down. Then the helicopters fly away. As they depart, Godzilla is distracted by his spinal fins glowing. This is probably the first scene that, on a rewatch, stuck out. Godzilla was stumbling about and getting used to his new form, and I liked the awkward, ungainly gait they gave him. As is worked out by the human cast, more on that later, Godzilla is mutating to suit his environment or his needs. His former form was too aquatic, so he metamorphosed into a more terrestrial creature. But it's one thing to want something, and another to use it. It's a new body, one Godzilla has to get used to, and so he waddles like an old drunkard, trying to remember which way is home. It adds a bit of character to this new Godzilla, something he sorely needs. Speaking of, as he continues his journey to wherever it was he was going, he stops. The helicopters arrive at about the same time, but it's not entirely clear if he stopped because of them or if it was just coincidence. Based on his lack of reaction to their leaving, or anything for that matter, it would appear it was coincidence, which then leaves me wondering why he stopped. In universe, no idea, he just did. In terms of filmmaking, he needed to be stationary to allow for the tense moment when... Well, let's leave that for the human side of the story, shall we? As the helicopters leave, Godzilla looks to his spinal fins. Again, as worked out by the human cast later, Godzilla is nuclear powered and is beginning to overheat from being out of the water. An alternative version of this scene could have Godzilla looking visibly exhausted or suffering from overheating. That way he would be standing still trying to recover, allowing for the scene to take place and giving him some expressiveness, again something he badly needs. Alas, we have what we have. The overheating is a nice detail. It's logically consistent, unlike the whole standing around bit, and a reference to Godzilla vs. Destroyer, where the big threat of the film was Godzilla overheating. This won't be the last time Godzilla vs. Destroyer is going to be mentioned in this video. After a hasty retreat to the sea and a long spell with the human cast, Godzilla returns, and now he's more recognizable as the giant monster we know and love, along with a blast of nostalgia to go with it. Once again, Godzilla slowly makes his way towards the city, his even larger form, making his movements deceptively slow. This is probably my favourite part of the film. The size and shape of this new form are relatively similar to the hasty Godzillas, but tweaked to look more horrific, more alien, a theme throughout this film's design of the Big G. The skin keeps the aesthetic of the old Godzillas, i.e. the bodily scars of nuclear bomb survivors. This aesthetic makes sense not only given the origins of this Godzilla, but also in context to a creature who keeps changing size and shape. The face is terrifying and reminiscent of the 1954 Godzilla, down to the beady but glaring eyes. One look at this visage lets you know this ain't your friendly neighborhood Godzilla. The spinal fins are used as radiators to manage body heat. The larger and spikier they are, the more surface area they have and the more heat can be dispersed. This gives the designers an excuse to make them look even more horrific to match the rest of the body, a clear design progression from earlier versions. The only complaint I have about the design is the arms. In still images and in the models, they look agonized and emotive, which is great, but in the film they look frozen and lifeless. They might be a reference since only one of the original suit's arms could be moved, makes them very noticeably unmoving. It would have been nice to see them doing something so they didn't look so artificial. Actually, there's another design complaint I have. Once again they pick the worst shot to introduce this new Godzilla. Granted, the very first shots are good, especially the close-up of his face.
You one ugly motherfucker.
But then they cut to a headless shot of his fat thighs. Why? As someone who owns a model of Shin Godzilla, I can say that, for the most part, his design looks great. It's only from one particular angle, dead on, that it loses some of that uniquely grotesque fascination and starts to look silly. From straight on he looks like a butternut squash gone rotten. This is potentially down to either the original design being made for a suit actor, and after deciding to go with CGI instead, they didn't adjust anything so it kept the large legs. Or, like I said, this form was meant to hearken to the Heisei era Godzillas, who also had large legs, but tweaked to look more unsightly. If so, congrats, it looks awful. Alas, no Godzilla emerging from the sea? I know technically we see him walking out of the ocean, but he's barely ankle deep. In pretty much every film, Godzilla enters stage left by rising out of the sea. It's like his gimmick or something. Earlier in the film we saw the smaller form of Godzilla dragging itself out of the water, along a river and into the city streets. Now with this new large form, it would be like the Godzilla films of old to see him make his grand entrance. Instead he's already up and out. IR disappoint. By contrast, Godzilla's walk through the built-up area is brilliantly well done. Gone is the conservative street navigation of his former, smaller self, trampling all before him and leaving destruction in his wake. For now, the emotionless, unmoving features match the uncaring crushing of society beneath his gargantuan feet. This may or may not be a subtle jab at big companies or government bodies who build for profit at the expense of safety, like, say, the people who built and maintained a certain nuclear power plant. But it almost certainly represents the uncaring nature of, well, nature, and of disasters, be they natural or man-made. Beyond metaphoric extractions, Godzilla's landing is presented awfully well. Shots from the streets, shots from the train, shots from a long way away. All these low perspective shots really instill the scale of this titanic beast. This is something the older films struggled to do, but the new films, including the American legendary films, have managed really well. Also, these really long distance shots make Godzilla feel like a part of the scenery, a part of the landscape. This not only embeds this Godzilla into the realism of the film, but it's a perfect metaphor for how Godzilla is a part of the Japanese culture, that he's just as much a part of Japan as the land, sea and sky. I particularly like this shot, because one more thing I wanted to mention before moving on, overlook, but they are very similar to scenes from the original Godzilla. When he too first landed in 1954, Godzilla stomped through some old tiled roof buildings. It's another homage to the original film. As he approaches a group of high-rise buildings, an attack begins. Helicopters pelt Godzilla with bullets and missiles, followed by tanks and heavy artillery, raining fire down on his legs and head. The assault is topped off with bombs being dropped from planes overhead, and it appears to be working as Godzilla first stops his advance, then turns aside. But the illusion of success is dispelled as Godzilla carries on his long walk. This whole scene gets across just how unstoppable this Godzilla really is. Once again we get lots of really nice perspective shots, this time dynamic ones from the tanks, helicopters and even the bombs. His eye protection that is reminiscent of some reptiles such as crocodiles. And once again we get a bit of nostalgic callback to the original film with Godzilla flipping a bridge. Its narrators don't want to bring this up. The budget on this film was tiny, and it's clear where some corners were cut, like here. This will only become more evident as the film goes on. How little to no damage the military did, and B, how grotesquely deformed his skin is. It shows the futility of combating this godlike creature. It also shows how broken he is, how malformed, and, probably, how pained he is, through actions or shows of emotion. As Godzilla stomps into the city proper, causing power outages as he goes, 2 bombs fall from the sky. Unlike the harmless bouncing of the bullets, missiles and bombs from earlier, these 2 plunge through Godzilla's skin and into his back. Their victories are told in flame and blood. We get more visually impactful images of Godzilla, his glowing flesh standing out in the darkness caused by his passing. And speaking of impactful, we get some of the most physical damage a Godzilla has ever suffered on film, alongside assaults from Biollante and Mechagodzilla. Someone inevitably brings up heavy-duty weapons like bunker busters, and there is rarely a good answer to them other than, we have to accept they don't work. In Shin Godzilla we find out that they do in fact work, and they do a lot of damage. However, this Godzilla is different than most, so whereas such damage might kill or even cripple another monster, I pointed out earlier that they used the deeper, bellowing roar of the 1954 Godzilla for the smaller version of Shin Godzilla. The 4th Godzilla form uses the latter, higher pitched roar. I can see why they did it this way, as the changing forms have been a representative progression of Godzilla through the years, amongst other things. However, I still think they should have been the other way around. The higher pitched roar sounds more like a scream that would have fit in nicely with the pained depiction of the smaller forms. I suppose it doesn't hurt to have the roars this way around. Plus they do something with it at the end that's somewhat cool. Hell, let's do this properly. Let me know what you think about the roars. At any rate, we're at the main event. The explosion in his body builds and builds. His mouth opens wide, wider than it should, splitting into 3 sections like some alien creature. From it spews a sooty smog that flows through the city streets like a the harmful presence from the sky. 2 more bombers approach, cutting through buildings all around him. Slowly, the beam dissipates, back to flame, to smoke, to nothing. Godzilla stands tall, surrounded by a burning city, his enemies defeated, before bowing his head in exhaustion and falling into a deep sleep. This entire sequence is wonderful to watch and to listen to. Changing Godzilla's colour scheme to purple was a bold move. It makes this Godzilla even more striking and visually distinct than he already was. The transition of the breath attack is really well done. It has a mechanical feel to it, like a gas torch being turned on and focused. The transition from smoke to fire to laser visually embodies the development of Godzilla's breath attack throughout the years, and take both Shin Godzilla and Godzilla Earth have laser-like breath attacks. They are so fast they cover great distances almost instantly, which is in complete contrast to the monsters that move very fast at all. Shin Godzilla's laser is especially potent, as the slightest, slowest movement of his head sweeps his beam over a great distance. Speaking of, I like the way that Godzilla, after having destroyed the bombers, waves the laser around every which way. It's like he's saying, uh-oh, what do I do with this thing? How do I switch it off? His cooling down and hibernation after this exercise gives the audience an understanding of his abilities and their mechanical limits, which comes into play later. And once again, the visuals the breath causes are stunning, and in this case demonic, with Godzilla silhouetted by the burning city, a symbolic reminder of history if ever there was one. I do have some issues with this event, and unfortunately this is where we begin to see what I can only presume is the limited budget having an effect. The distance the fire covers is over the top in my opinion. That alone, like buildings further away from the epicenter blackened with soot. But the fire reaching as far as it did in all directions was too much. In the original film, and indeed others, Godzilla moves around, stomping through cities and spreading fires in his wake. It's right for this fire to cover this much, this fast. It creates this striking visual after the fact, and this gorgeous shot, but these could have been reduced and still been as striking. The distance the laser covers more than makes up for a reduced fire effect. Similarly, the multiple lasers out the spine was overdone as far as I'm concerned. It makes sense, I can't mock that. The spinal fins are the heat radiators, so easier escapes for its energy is completely logical. But the skin and a great progression of the breath attack, to then have that immediately outdone by the back attack? Having the updated breath attack be immediately outdone, but we'll get to that. And he's not looking that way, which leads into the possible budget limitations. Up until now, the largest form of Godzilla was very slow moving, which made sense considering the scale of the bastard. This is something that works really well in this film, since he's not fighting another monster and there's no need for fast-paced action. This film, like the legendary films before and after it, are leaning much closer to realism, and the slower movements work well with that. Which is why it was so weird to see Godzilla quickly step forward when using his back attack. More so when, after the attack is over, he takes 2 quick juddering steps forward before stopping. To get my point across, if I slow the clips down myself, I think it looks a lot more natural and in rhythm with the earlier scenes. After the carefully considered movements up until this point, I can only imagine the reason behind these sudden lurches can only be down to budgetary issues, i.e., time, budget, or both wouldn't allow for a full slow render of the animation, so they had to speed it up and shorten it. If this was the only instance of it, I might have given it a disappointed shrug and a pass, but it's not the last time this comes up. I also find it odd his tail stays up when he goes into hibernation. This is a nitpick for sure, especially after everything else I just talked about, but it really bothers me. At the end of the film it makes more sense that his tail stays up, but here in context it should be on the ground. It does exactly this in a later scene, which only makes its uprightness here odd. But like I said, this is a small issue in the grand scheme of things. This is our introduction to Shin Godzilla, and altogether I think it's mostly positive. Visually striking, mechanically sound, and nostalgically minded, it makes for a great update and adaptation of Godzilla, i.e. Godzilla mutating, and uses it not only to make tribute to the history of Godzilla in cinema, but transmogrifies it to the modern era. The mutations changing the scale of Godzilla, roars from different eras applied to these forms, and the breath attacks changing from smoke to fire to laser, all music follows suit, a mix of old tracks and newer inspirations. These nostalgic callbacks help cement the themes of the film, those being the criticisms of the 2011 natural and nuclear disasters in the form of the Big G himself. Godzilla's character does suffer somewhat because of this, as he could certainly do with some more character traits besides glaring ominously. There are some aesthetic choices I'd change as well, like the arms and the legs, along with reassigning the roars and a few niggles regards certain abilities. Some of these choices are almost certainly affected by the budget, along with some effects like the weirdly rippling skin of the transformation and the 2 quick steps. Overall though, Shin Godzilla as a monster is a welcome, serious update taken from an angle hitherto untaken. Monster really Godzilla without a human element. Thank you for watching this video. Part 2 will be coming out in a few weeks' time, with any luck. Leave a comment if you have any thoughts on what I've said in the video, and make sure you're subscribed so you know when the next part actually comes out. Links to my Patreon and Etsy store are in the description as always. Once again, thank you for watching.